Hello, my dear adventurers. If you like the story, please subscribe. Welcome back to another evening of shared stories and adventures. Tonight, we're settling in by the fireside with a collection of tales from the Brothers Grimm. But these aren't the sanitized versions you might remember from childhood. These are the original stories, the ones whispered in German villages on cold winter nights, filled with wonder and warning, magic and consequence. We'll be visiting a humble cottage where a grandmother shares these timeless tales with her grandchildren while the snow falls softly outside. So grab a warm blanket, pour yourself some hot tea or cocoa, and let's step into a world where wishes have prices, kindness is rewarded, and nothing is quite as simple as it seems. Let's begin. Let's begin. The cottage sat nestled at the edge of the black forest, its thatch roof heavy with fresh snow. Smoke curled from the chimney, carrying the scent of baking apples and cinnamon. Inside, the fire crackled in the stone hearth, casting dancing shadows. Grandmother Hilda sat in her rocking chair, her hands busy with knitting needles. She was old, perhaps 70 winters, with silver hair braided at her neck. Her face was lined with the marks of a life well lived, but her eyes were still sharp and bright as a winter morning. At her feet sat her 3 grandchildren, Klaus, the eldest at 12, all gangly limbs and serious expression, Greta, 9 years old, with her mother's fair hair, and little Hans, barely 6, clutching a wooden toy horse his grandfather had carved. The children had arrived that morning, sent by their parents who lived in the village. A winter storm was coming, and it was safer for the children to stay with grandmother until it passed. Now, as evening settled and the wind began to howl around the cottage, they were warm and fed and ready for stories. Grandmother Hilda was known throughout the village for her tales. Not just any stories, but the old tales, the true tales, passed down through generations. "Tell us a story, grandmother," Greta said, her voice eager. She'd been the first to finish her supper of bread and cheese and dried sausage, and now sat with her chin propped on her hands, watching the old woman expectantly. "Yes, please," Hans chimed in, his voice high and sweet. A good one, with magic." Klaus said nothing, but Hilda noticed how he leaned forward slightly, trying to appear disinterested but failing utterly. The boy was at that age where he thought himself too old for such things, yet couldn't quite let go of the wonder. Hilda set down her knitting with a small smile. "Very well, then. But you must understand, children, that the old stories are not like the ones the traveling performers tell in the town square. The old stories have teeth." "We're not babies," Klaus said, a touch defensively. "We can handle it." "Can you now?" Hilda's eyes twinkled. "We shall see. Very well, then. Tonight I shall tell you several tales from the collection of the Brothers Grimm." She reached for her clay cup and took a long drink of the herbal tea she'd brewed earlier. Chamomile and mint, good for the voice and soothing to the throat. Then she settled back in her chair, the firelight casting half her face in shadow, and began. "Our first tale tonight is one you may have heard whispers of. It is called The Golden Goose. Listen well, for it teaches much about the nature of kindness and how goodness is often rewarded in unexpected ways. The children shifted closer, Hans abandoning his toy horse to hug his knees to his chest. Even Klaus forgot to look bored. There was once a man who had 3 sons. The youngest was called Dummling, and he was despised and mocked and put down at every opportunity. It happened that the eldest son decided to go into the forest to cut wood, and before he went, his mother gave him a beautiful sweet cake and a bottle of wine so that he would not suffer from hunger or thirst. When he entered the forest, he met a little old grey man who greeted him kindly and said, "Give me a piece of your cake and a drink of your wine. I am so hungry and thirsty." But the clever son answered, "If I give you my cake and wine, I will have none for myself. Be off with you." And he left the little man standing there and went on his way. Soon after, he began to cut down a tree, but before long he made a false stroke, and the axe cut into his arm, so he had to go home and have it bandaged. This was the little grey man's doing. Next, the second son went into the forest, and his mother gave him, as she had given the eldest, a sweet cake and a bottle of wine. The little old grey man met him also, and asked for a piece of cake and a drink of wine. But the second son spoke sensibly too, and said, "What I give to you, I lose myself. Be off with you." And he left the little man standing there and went on. His punishment was not delayed. His punishment was not delayed. Then Dummling said, "Father, let me go out and cut wood." The father answered, "Your brothers have hurt themselves doing it. You had better leave it alone. You know nothing about it." But Dummling begged so long that at last the father said, "Very well then, go. You know nothing about it." But Dummling begged so long that at last the father said, "Very well then, go." Oh, when Dummling came to the forest, the little old grey man met him also, and greeted him, saying, "Give me a piece of your cake and a drink from your bottle. I am so hungry and thirsty." Dummling answered, "I have only a cake baked in ashes and sour beer, but if that will satisfy you, let us sit down and eat together." So they sat down, and when Dummling pulled out his ash cake, it had become a sweet fine cake, and his sour beer had become good wine. They ate and drank, and afterward the little man said, "Because you have a kind heart and are willing to share what you have, I will grant you good fortune. There stands an old tree." Dummling went and cut down the tree, and when it fell, there among the roots sat a goose with feathers of pure gold. He lifted it up and carried it with him to an inn where he intended to spend the night. The innkeeper had 3 daughters, who saw the goose and were curious to know what sort of wonderful bird it was. The eldest thought, "I shall soon find an opportunity to pull out a feather." As soon as Dummling had gone out, she seized the goose by the wing, but her fingers and hands stuck fast to it. Soon after, the second sister came, intending also to pluck a golden feather for herself. But she had scarcely touched her sister when she was held fast. At last the third came with the same intention, and the others screamed out, "Keep away! For goodness sake, keep away!" But she did not understand why she should keep away. She thought, "If they are there, I may as well be there too." She ran to them, and as soon as she touched her sister, she stuck fast to her. She thought, "If they are there, I may as well be there too." She ran to them, and as soon as she touched her sister, she stuck fast to her. Greta giggled. "They were stuck? Indeed they were," Hilda said with a smile. The next morning, Dummling picked up the goose under his arm and set out, paying no attention to the 3 girls who were hanging onto it. They had to run along behind him, left and right, wherever his legs took him. In the middle of the fields they met the parson, and when he saw the procession he said, "For shame, you bold girls! Why are you running after the young man like that? Is that proper behaviour?" With that, he took hold of the youngest by the hand to pull her away. Not long after, the sexton came by and saw the parson running behind 3 girls. He was astonished and called out, "Hey there, your reverence! Where are you going so fast? Don't forget we have a christening today." He ran after him and caught him by the sleeve, but he too stuck fast. As the 5 of them trotted along in this way, one behind the other, 2 labourers came along the road carrying their hoes. The parson called out to them and begged them to set him and the sexton free. The parson called out to them and begged them to set him and the sexton free. Klaus laughed despite himself. That must have looked very silly. "Oh, it did indeed," Hilda agreed. Eventually, they came to a city where a king ruled who had a daughter so serious that no one could make her laugh. The king had made a decree that whoever could make her laugh should marry her. The king had made a decree that whoever could make her laugh should marry her. Then Dummling asked to have her for his wife, but the king did not like having Dummling for a son-in-law, and he made all kinds of excuses. He said Dummling must first bring him a man who could drink a whole cellar full of wine. Dummling thought of the little grey man who could surely help him, and went out to the forest. In the same place where he had cut down the tree, he saw a man sitting with a very sad face. Dummling asked what was troubling him. The man answered, "I have such a great thirst that I cannot quench it. Cold water does not agree with me." "I can help you," said Dummling. Then Dummling asked again for his bride, but the king was annoyed that a common fellow whom everyone called Dummling should carry off his daughter. He made a new condition. Dummling must first find a man who could eat a mountain of bread. Dummling did not think long, but went straight to the forest. In the same place sat a man who was tightening a strap around his body, making a very sad face and saying, "I have eaten a whole oven full of rolls, but what good is that when one is as hungry as I am?" In the same place sat a man who was tightening a strap around his body, making a very sad face and saying, "I have eaten a whole oven full of rolls, but what good is that when one is as hungry as I am?" Dummling was glad about this and said, "Get up and come with me. You shall eat to your heart's content." He led him to the king's court, where all the flour in the entire kingdom had been brought together and baked into a huge mountain of bread. For the 3rd time, Dummling asked for his bride, but the king again sought a way out and demanded a ship that could sail on both land and water. "As soon as you come sailing in such a ship," he said, "you shall have my daughter as your wife." Dummling went straight to the forest, and there sat the little old grey man to whom he had given his cake. The little man said, "I have drunk for you, and I have eaten for you, and I will also give you the ship. I do all this because you were kind to me." Then he gave him the ship that could sail on land and water, and when the king saw it, he could no longer withhold his daughter. "He won because he was kind," Hans said happily, "even though everyone thought he was dumb." "Exactly so," Hilda said. "The brothers, who thought themselves clever, were actually foolish, for they could not see beyond their own needs. But Dummling, whom everyone mocked, had the truest wisdom of all. He understood that sharing what little he had was more important than hoarding it. And for that kindness, he was rewarded beyond measure." She reached for her tea again and took a long sip. Outside, the wind had picked up once more, rattling the shutters, but inside the cottage all was warmth and safety. "Shall I tell you another?" Hilda asked. "Yes, please," all three children said together. "Very well. This next tale is called The Bremen Town Musicians. It is a story about friendship and courage, and about how those who are cast aside by the world can find their own place if they stick together." The fire crackled and popped, sending up sparks, and Hilda's voice took on that storytelling quality once more. "A certain man had a donkey that had carried sacks to the mill faithfully for many long years, but the donkey's strength was giving out, and he was becoming less and less fit for work. His master began to consider getting rid of him, but the donkey, sensing that something bad was in the wind, ran away and set out on the road to Bremen. There, he thought, I can surely become a town musician. After he had walked for a while, he found a hunting dog lying by the roadside, panting like one who had run until he was tired. "Why are you panting so hard, old fellow?" asked the donkey. The dog replied, "Ah, because I am old and grow weaker every day and can no longer hunt. My master wanted to kill me, so I ran away. But now, how am I to earn my bread?" "I tell you what," said the donkey, "I am going to Bremen to become a town musician. Come with me and take up music too. Come with me and take up music too." Before long, they came upon a cat sitting by the roadside with a face as long as 3 rainy days. "Now then, what has gone wrong with you, old Whiskers?" asked the donkey. The cat replied, "Who can be cheerful when his life is in danger? Because I am now getting old, and my teeth are worn to stumps, and I prefer to sit by the fire and purr rather than chase mice. My mistress wanted to drown me. I managed to escape, but now I do not know what to do." "Come with us to Bremen," said the donkey. "I managed to escape, but now I do not know what to do." "Come with us to Bremen," said the donkey. The 3 runaways soon came past a farmyard, where a rooster was sitting on the gate, crowing with all his might. "Your crowing goes right through one's heart," said the donkey. "What is the matter?" The rooster answered, "I have been prophesying fine weather because it is the day when Our Lady washes the Christ child's little shirts and wants to dry them. But because Sunday guests are coming tomorrow, the housewife has no pity and has told the cook that she intends to eat me in the soup. So this evening I am to have my head cut off. Now I am crowing at the top of my lungs while I still can. "Nonsense, Redcomb," said the donkey. "You had better come away with us. We are going to Bremen. You can find something better than death anywhere. You can find something better than death anywhere." They could not reach the town of Bremen in one day, however, and by evening they came to a forest where they meant to spend the night. The donkey and the dog lay down under a large tree. The cat climbed up into the branches, and the rooster flew right to the top, where he was safest. Before he went to sleep, he looked around once more in all 4 directions. Then he thought he saw a little spark of light burning in the distance. So they made their way to the place where the light was, and soon saw it shine brighter and grow larger until they came to a well-lit robber's house. The donkey, as the biggest, went to the window and looked in. "What do you see, old grey horse?" asked the rooster. "What do I see?" answered the donkey. "A table covered with good things to eat and drink, and robbers sitting at it enjoying themselves." "That would be the right sort of thing for us," said the rooster. "A table covered with good things to eat and drink, and robbers sitting at it enjoying themselves." "That would be the right sort of thing for us," said the rooster. Then the animals put their heads together and discussed how they might manage to drive the robbers out. At last they thought of a plan. The donkey was to place his 4 feet upon the window-sill. The dog was to jump on the donkey's back. The cat was to climb upon the dog. And lastly, the rooster was to fly up and perch upon the cat's head. When this was done, at a given signal they began to perform their music together. The donkey brayed, the dog barked, the cat meowed, and the rooster crowed. The donkey brayed, the dog barked, the cat meowed, and the rooster crowed. At this horrible noise, the robbers sprang up, thinking no other than that a ghost had come in, and they fled in terror into the forest. Greta clapped her hands together. "They scared the robbers away." "Indeed they did," Hilda said with a smile. And when the 4 musicians had finished, they put out the light, and each sought a sleeping place according to his nature and habits. The donkey laid himself down upon some straw in the yard, the dog behind the door, the cat upon the hearth near the warm ashes, and the rooster perched himself upon a beam of the roof. The donkey laid himself down upon some straw in the yard, the dog behind the door, the cat upon the hearth near the warm ashes, and the rooster perched himself upon a beam of the roof. When it was past midnight, and the robbers saw from a distance that the light was no longer burning in their house, and all appeared quiet, the captain said, "We ought not to have let ourselves be frightened out of our wits." He ordered one of the robbers to go and examine the house. The man found all still, and went into the kitchen to light a candle. He saw the cat's glowing fiery eyes, and took them for live coals. He held a match to them to light it, but the cat did not understand the joke, and flew in his face, spitting and scratching. He was dreadfully frightened, and ran to the back door. But the dog, who lay there, sprang up and bit his leg. As he ran across the yard by the straw pile, the donkey gave him a smart kick with his hind foot. Then the robber ran back as fast as he could to his captain, and said, "Ah, there is a horrible witch sitting in the house, who spat on me and scratched my face with her long claws. And by the door stands a man with a knife, who stabbed me in the leg. and in the yard there lies a black monster, who beat me with a wooden club. And above, upon the roof, sits the judge, who called out, 'Bring the rogue here to me.'" Klaus laughed out loud. They thought the animals were monsters and witches. "After this," Hilda continued, "the robbers never again dared enter the house." But it suited the 4 Bremen musicians so well that they did not care to leave it any more. "I like that one," Hans said, yawning. "They all found a home together." "That is the beauty of it," Hilda said. "Each of them was cast out and considered useless. The donkey was too old to work. The dog could no longer hunt. The cat could not catch mice. The rooster was meant for the pot. But together they were strong. Together they found a place where they belonged. That is a lesson worth remembering, children." She glanced at the window, where snow was piling up on the sill. The storm had settled into a steady fall, and the world outside was becoming a kingdom of white. "One more tale before you sleep," she said. "This one is called The Elves and the Shoemaker. It is a gentle story, a kind story about how goodness given freely is repaid in unexpected ways." The children settled down, Hans now in Greta's lap, Klaus still leaning against the wall, but with his eyes half closed. There was once a shoemaker who worked very hard and was very honest, but still he could not earn enough to live upon. At last all he had in the world was gone, except just leather enough to make 1 pair of shoes. In the evening he cut out the shoes which he intended to begin working on the next morning. Then he said his prayers and went peacefully to bed. In the morning, after he had said his prayers and was preparing to sit down to work, he saw the 2 shoes standing finished upon his table. He was astonished and knew not what to think. He examined the workmanship. There was not 1 false stitch in the whole job. All was neat and true, and it was a complete masterpiece. That same day, a customer came in, and the shoes pleased him so well that he paid a price higher than usual for them. With the money, the shoemaker was able to buy leather for 2 pairs of shoes. In the evening he cut them out, intending to work on them the next morning with fresh spirit, but he had no need to do so, for when he got up the work was already done. Customers came and paid him handsomely for the shoes, so that he was able to buy leather for 4 pairs. Again he cut them out at night, and in the morning found them finished. And so it went on, and so it went on. One evening, not long before Christmas, when the shoemaker had been cutting out shoes as usual, he said to his wife, "How would it be if we were to sit up tonight and see who it is that does us this service?" His wife agreed, and they left a candle burning. At midnight, 2 little naked elves came in and sat down at the shoemaker's table. They took up the work that was cut out and began to stitch and sew and hammer with their little fingers so skillfully and quickly that the shoemaker could not believe his eyes. They did not stop until everything was finished and stood complete upon the table. Then they ran swiftly away. The next morning the wife said, "The little men have made us rich. We ought to show that we are grateful. They run about with nothing on, and they must freeze. I will make them little shirts and coats and vests and trousers, and I will knit each of them a pair of stockings, and you, husband, make each of them a little pair of shoes." The husband agreed gladly, and one evening, when everything was ready, they laid the gifts upon the table instead of the cut-out work. "And you, husband, make each of them a little pair of shoes." The husband agreed gladly, and one evening when everything was ready, they laid the gifts upon the table instead of the cut-out work. At midnight, the elves came bounding in, ready to set to work. But when they found the neat little clothes laid out for them, they stood for a moment quite surprised. Then they showed the greatest delight. They dressed themselves in the twinkling of an eye, putting on the beautiful clothes and singing. Hilda's voice became light and musical. "Now we're boys so fine and neat, why cobble more for others' feet?" Then they danced and skipped and leaped over chairs and benches. At last they danced out of the door. From that time on they came no more. But the shoemaker prospered in all that he undertook and lived happily ever after. The cottage was very quiet when Hilda finished. The fire had burned down to glowing coals, and the children were drowsy and warm. "That was nice," Greta said softly. The shoemaker and his wife were kind, and the elves helped them. And then they were kind back to the elves. "That is the way of the world when it works as it should," Hilda said. "Kindness begets kindness. Help given freely is help returned. The elves asked for nothing, and the shoemaker gave them what they needed. Both were richer for it." She stood slowly, her old bones creaking, and gathered blankets from the chest by the wall. The children had a pallet prepared near the fire, piled with soft furs and woolen blankets. She helped them settle in, tucking the covers around them. "Grandmother," Klaus said, his voice sleepy, "why do the old tales always have lessons?" "Because stories are how we teach the young what the old have learned," Hilda replied, smoothing his hair. "The tales survive because they carry truth. They show us how to live, how to treat one another, what to value and what to avoid." "I think I understand," Klaus mumbled, already half asleep. Hilda returned to her chair and picked up her knitting. She would work a while longer, keeping watch over her sleeping grandchildren while the storm raged outside. The fire cast a gentle glow over the scene, 3 children sleeping peacefully, the old woman with her needles clicking softly, the cottage warm and safe against the winter night. Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing the forest in silence. The black forest was dark and deep, full of its own stories and secrets. But here, in this small cottage at the forest's edge, there was light and warmth and love. Here, the old tales lived on, passed from grandmother to grandchildren, carrying their wisdom through the generations. Hilda looked at the sleeping children and smiled. Tomorrow when they woke, there would be hot porridge and honey. There would be games to play and chores to do. And tomorrow night, if they asked, there would be more stories. The Grimm tales had no end, after all. There were hundreds of them, each one a jewel polished by time, each one holding some truth about the world and the people in it. She worked her needles in the firelight, the rhythmic clicking a counterpoint to the wind outside. The wool was soft in her hands, the pattern familiar. She was making a scarf for Greta, who always felt the cold. small acts of love, woven stitch by stitch, just as the old tales were woven word by word, passed down through the years. The fire crackled softly. The children breathed in the peaceful rhythm of deep sleep. The storm raged, but could not touch them here. Grandmother Hilda kept her vigil, the keeper of stories, the guardian of her grandchildren, the link between past and future. And so the night passed in the cottage at the forest's edge, where the old tales lived and the old magic still held sway, where kindness was rewarded, evil was punished, and 3 children slept safely, their dreams filled with golden geese and brave musicians, with helpful elves and enchanted fish, with all the wonder and wisdom that the brothers Grimm had collected so long ago. Outside, the snow fell and fell, covering the world in white silence. But inside there was warmth and light and love, and that perhaps was the greatest magic of all. The morning arrived soft and grey, the storm having passed in the night. Grandmother Hilda woke in her chair, her neck stiff from sleeping upright, her knitting fallen into her lap. The fire had burned down to cold ashes, and pale winter light filtered through the shutters. She stood slowly, stretching out the kinks in her back, and moved to the window. Outside, the world had transformed. Snow lay thick and pristine over everything, smoothing the rough edges of the forest, turning the familiar landscape into something from a fairy tale itself. The trees bent under their white burden, and icicles hung from the cottage eaves like crystal daggers. The children still slept, wrapped in their cocoon of blankets and furs. Hilda smiled at the sight of them. Klaus had thrown one arm over his face. Greta had curled into a tight ball. Little Hans clutched his wooden horse even in sleep, holding it close to his chest. She moved quietly to the hearth and began the morning tasks. The ashes needed clearing, the fire needed building. She worked with the ease of long practice, her hands knowing the motions without thought. Soon a small flame was crackling, growing stronger as she fed it kindling and then larger logs. The warmth began to spread through the cottage, chasing away the night's chill. She filled her kettle with water from the large clay jug and hung it over the fire. From her stores she gathered oats and dried apples and a precious stick of cinnamon. Porridge this morning, sweet and warm, to fortify the children for whatever the day might bring. As she worked, Klaus stirred and sat up, rubbing his eyes. His hair stuck up in all directions, and he looked younger in that moment, less the serious boy trying to be a man, and more the child he still was. "Good morning, Grandmother," he said, his voice still rough with sleep. "Good morning, dear one," Hilda replied. "Did you sleep well?" "I dreamed about the Bremen musicians," Klaus said, stretching. "They were having a concert in the town square, and everyone came to listen. Even the robbers came, but they were friendly now. They'd learned their lesson. A good dream," Hilda said, stirring the porridge. "Dreams often continue the stories we tell ourselves before sleep." Greta woke next, sitting up and immediately looking around, as if trying to remember where she was. Then her face cleared, and she smiled. "It smells good, Grandmother. What are you making?" "Porridge with apples and cinnamon. It will be ready soon. Wake your brother, would you?" Greta leaned over and gently shook hands. The little boy's eyes opened, and he looked confused for a moment before recognizing where he was. "Is it morning?" "It is indeed," Greta said, "and grandmother is making breakfast." The children emerged from their blankets and padded over to the fire, drawn by its warmth. They stood in a semicircle watching Hilda stir the pot, breathing in the sweet smell of cinnamon and cooking oats. "Will you tell us more stories today?" Hans asked hopefully. "Perhaps," Hilda said, "if there is time. But first, breakfast. Then there are chores to be done, even on a snowy day, perhaps especially on a snowy day." "I can bring in the firewood," Klaus said, drawing himself up. "I'm strong enough." "I know you are," Hilda said warmly, "and I would appreciate the help. Greta, you can help me with the chickens. Hans, you shall keep the fire fed while we're outside. That is an important job. Can you do it?" Hans nodded seriously. "I won't let it go out." They ate their porridge sitting close to the fire, blowing on each spoonful to cool it. The sweetness of the apples and the warmth of the cinnamon made it feel like a special meal, not just ordinary oats. Hilda had honey as well, a small pot of it, and she let each child have a spoonful to stir into their bowl. After breakfast, they dressed in their warmest clothes. Klaus put on his heavy wool coat and wrapped a scarf around his neck. Greta pulled on thick stockings and her fur-lined boots. Even Hans, staying inside, put on an extra tunic for warmth. Klaus ventured out first, pushing open the door against the snow that had drifted against it. The cold air rushed in, sharp and clean, taking their breath away. He stepped out into the white world, sinking up to his knees. "It's deep," he called back. "Very deep." Hilda and Greta followed, closing the door behind them to keep the warmth inside with Hans. The world was breathtakingly beautiful in its winter dress. Every branch, every stone, every surface wore white. The sky was a pale gray, promising more snow to come. But for now, the air was still. They made their way to the woodshed, breaking a path through the untouched snow. Klaus loaded his arms with logs while Hilda and Greta continued to the chicken coop. The hens were alive and well, huddled together for warmth, clucking irritably at being disturbed. Greta scattered grain for them and refilled their water, breaking the thin layer of ice that had formed on top. "Grandmother," Greta said as they worked, "the stories you told last night, were they real?" Hilda considered carefully. "The truth in the story is real. Those who are cast aside still have value. Friendship gives us strength. Working together we accomplish what we cannot alone." "But what about the elves?" Greta pressed. "There are more things in this world than we can see or understand, child. I cannot say for certain about elves, but when we are kind, good things come to us in unexpected ways. Whether that is magic or simply the way the world works, I leave for you to decide." They settled by the fire once more. Hilda made tea with dried mint, chamomile, and honey. The children cupped their hands around the warm mugs. "Grandmother," Klaus said after a while, "would you tell us another story? Not tonight, but now." "Please," Greta added. "We did all the chores." "So you did," Hilda agreed, settling into her chair. "Very well, then, I shall tell you the tale of Hansel and Gretel. But be warned, this is not a gentle story. This is a story with darkness in it, though it ends with light." The children pulled blankets around themselves and leaned in close. "Near a great forest," Hilda began. there lived a poor woodcutter with his wife and his 2 children. The boy was called Hansel, and the girl Gretel. The family had very little to eat, and once, when a great famine came to the land, the woodcutter could no longer provide even their daily bread. One night, as he lay in bed worrying about this, tossing and turning with anxiety, he sighed and said to his wife, "What is to become of us? How can we feed our children when we have nothing for ourselves?" His wife, who was the children's stepmother, replied, "I will tell you what we must do. Early tomorrow morning, we will take the children out into the thickest part of the forest. We will make a fire for them and give each of them a little piece of bread. Then we will go about our work and leave them alone. That's terrible," Greta said, her eyes wide. She wanted to abandon them in the forest. She did indeed, Hilda said. The woodcutter was horrified. "No, wife," he said, "I cannot do that. How could I have the heart to leave my children alone in the forest? Wild animals would soon come and tear them to pieces." But the stepmother replied, "You fool, then we must all 4 die of hunger. You may as well start planing the boards for our coffins." She gave him no peace until he agreed. But the 2 children had not been able to sleep for hunger, and they heard what their stepmother said to their father. Gretel wept bitter tears and said to Hansel, "Now we are lost." "Be quiet, Gretel," said Hansel, "and do not worry. I will find a way to help us." When the parents had fallen asleep, Hansel got up, put on his little coat, opened the door, and crept outside. The moon shone brightly, and the white pebbles that lay in front of the house glittered like newly minted coins. Hansel stooped and filled his coat pockets with as many pebbles as would fit. Then he went back and said to Gretel, "Be comforted, dear little sister, and sleep in peace." At daybreak, even before the sun had risen, the stepmother came and woke the 2 children. "Get up, you lazy things. We are going into the forest to gather wood." She gave each of them a little piece of bread and said, "There is something for your dinner, but do not eat it before then, for you will get nothing more." Gretel put the bread in her apron pocket, since Hansel's pockets were full of pebbles. "We are going into the forest to gather wood." She gave each of them a little piece of bread and said, "There is something for your dinner, but do not eat it before then, for you will get nothing more." Gretel put the bread in her apron pocket, since Hansel's pockets were full of pebbles. When they had walked a short time, Hansel stood still and looked back at the house. And he did this again and again. His father said, "Hansel, why are you looking back and lagging behind? Pay attention and do not forget to use your legs." "Ah, father," said Hansel, "I am looking at my little white cat, which is sitting up on the roof to say goodbye to me." The stepmother said, "Fool, that is not your cat. That is the morning sun shining on the chimney." But Hansel had not been looking at his cat. Klaus nodded approvingly. He was clever. He was marking the way home. "Indeed he was," Hilda said. When they reached the middle of the forest, the father said, "Now gather some wood, children. I will make a fire, so you will not be cold." Hansel and Gretel gathered brushwood until they had a little mountain of it. The brushwood was lit, And when the flames were burning high, the stepmother said, "Now lie down by the fire, children, and rest. We are going into the forest to cut wood. We are going into the forest to cut wood." Hansel and Gretel sat by the fire, and when midday came, each ate their little piece of bread. They thought their father was still nearby, because they could hear the sound of an axe. But it was not an axe. It was a branch that the father had fastened to a dead tree, and the wind was blowing it back and forth. When at last they woke, it was already dark night. Gretel began to cry and said, "How will we ever get out of the forest?" But Hansel comforted her. "Just wait a little while until the moon has risen, and then we shall find the way." When the full moon had risen, Hansel took his little sister by the hand and followed the pebbles, which shone like newly minted coins, and showed them the way. "Just wait a little while until the moon has risen, and then we shall find the way." When the full moon had risen, Hansel took his little sister by the hand and followed the pebbles, which shone like newly minted coins, and showed them the way. They knocked at the door, and when the stepmother opened it and saw that it was Hansel and Gretel, she said, "You wicked children, why did you sleep so long in the forest?" "They came home," Hans said happily, "because Hansel was smart with the pebbles." "They did indeed," Hilda said. But the story does not end there. Not long afterward, there was again great need throughout the land, and the children heard their stepmother say to their father in bed one night, "Everything has been eaten again. We have only half a loaf of bread left, and then the story ends. The children must go. We will take them deeper into the forest so they cannot find their way out." The father's heart was heavy, and he thought it would be better to share the last bite with the children. But the stepmother would not listen to him. She scolded him and reproached him. He who says A must also say B, and because he had given in the first time, he had to give in the second time as well. But the children were still awake and had heard the conversation. When the parents were asleep, Hansel got up again and wanted to go out and gather pebbles as he had done before. But the stepmother had locked the door, and Hansel could not get out. Nevertheless, he comforted his little sister and said, "Do not cry, Gretel. Sleep peacefully. God will surely help us." Early the next morning, the stepmother came and got the children out of bed. They received their little piece of bread, even smaller than the time before. On the way to the forest, Hansel crumbled his bread in his pocket and stopped often to throw crumbs on the ground. "Hansel, why are you stopping and looking around?" said the father. "Keep walking." "I am looking at my little pigeon sitting on the roof. It wants to say goodbye to me," answered Hansel. "Fool," said the stepmother, "that is not your pigeon." "Fool," said the stepmother, "that is not your pigeon." The stepmother led the children still deeper into the forest, to a place where they had never been in all their lives. Again, a large fire was made, and the stepmother said, "Just sit there, children. If you get tired, you can sleep a little. We are going into the forest to cut wood, and in the evening when we are finished, we will come and get you." When it was midday, Gretel shared her bread with Hansel, who had scattered his piece along the path. Then they fell asleep And the evening passed. Then they fell asleep, and the evening passed. They did not wake until it was dark night. Hansel comforted his little sister and said, "Just wait, Gretel, until the moon rises. Then we will see the breadcrumbs that I scattered. They will show us the way home." When the moon rose, they set out, but they found no crumbs, for the many thousands of birds that fly about in the woods and fields had eaten them all. Greta gasped. "The birds ate the bread. Now they're lost." They were indeed, Hilda said solemnly. Hansel said to Gretel, "We will find the way." But they did not find it. They walked the whole night and all the next day from morning until evening, but they could not get out of the forest. They were terribly hungry, for they had nothing to eat but a few berries that grew on the ground. It was now the third morning since they had left their father's house. They started walking again, but they only went deeper and deeper into the forest. If help did not come soon, they would perish. At midday, they saw a beautiful snow-white bird sitting on a branch. It sang so beautifully that they stood still and listened. When it finished its song, it spread its wings and flew ahead of them. They followed it until they came to a little house. The bird perched on the roof, and when they came closer, they saw that the little house was made of bread and covered with cake. "We will help ourselves to a good meal," said Hansel. "I will eat a piece of the roof, and Gretel, you can eat some of the window. That will be sweet." Hansel reached up and broke off a little of the roof to see how it tasted. Gretel stood by the window panes and nibbled at them. Hilda's voice became high and sing-song. "Nibble, nibble, little mouse, who is nibbling at my house?" The children answered, the wind, the heavenly child." And they went on eating without being distracted. Hansel, who found the roof tasted very good, tore down a large piece of it. Gretel pushed out an entire round window pane and sat down to enjoy it. Suddenly the door opened, and a very old woman supporting herself on a crutch came creeping out. Hansel and Gretel were so terribly frightened that they dropped what they were holding. But the old woman shook her head and said, "Oh, you dear children, who brought you here? Just come in and stay with me. No harm will come to you." She took them both by the hand and led them into her little house. A good meal of milk and pancakes with sugar, apples, and nuts was set before them. A good meal of milk and pancakes with sugar, apples, and nuts was set before them. But the old woman was a wicked witch, Hilda said, her voice dropping low. She had only pretended to be friendly. She had built her little bread house to lure children to her, and when one came into her power, she would kill it, cook it, and eat it. That was a feast day for her. Witches have red eyes and cannot see far, but they have a keen sense of smell, like animals, and they know when human beings are near. When Hansel and Gretel had come close to her, she had laughed wickedly and said mockingly, "I have them." Hans had moved closer to Greta, his eyes wide with fear and fascination. Early in the morning, before the children were awake, the witch got up, looked at them both sleeping so sweetly with their full red cheeks, and muttered to herself, "That will be a good mouthful." She grabbed Hansel with her withered hand and carried him to a little stable, where she locked him behind a barred door. He could scream all he wanted. It would do him no good. Then she went to Gretel, shook her until she woke, and cried, "Get up, lazy thing. Fetch water and cook something good for your brother. He is locked outside in the stable and must be fattened up." Gretel began to cry bitterly, but it was all in vain. She had to do what the wicked witch demanded. Now the best food was cooked for poor Hansel, but Gretel received nothing but crab shells. Every morning the old woman crept out to the stable and called, "Hansel, stick out your fingers so I can feel if you are fat yet." But Hansel stuck out a little bone, and the old woman, who had bad eyes and could not see it, thought it was Hansel's finger. When 4 weeks had passed and Hansel still seemed thin, impatience overcame her and she would wait no longer. "Hey, Gretel," she called to the girl, "hurry up and fetch some water. Whether Hansel is fat or thin, tomorrow I will slaughter him and cook him." Oh, how the poor little sister grieved as she carried the water, and how the tears flowed down her cheeks. "Dear God, please help us," she cried. "If only the wild animals in the forest had devoured us, at least we would have died together." "Stop your blubbering," said the old woman. "If only the wild animals in the forest had devoured us, at least we would have died together." "Stop your blubbering," said the old woman. Early the next morning Gretel had to go out, hang up the kettle with water, and light the fire. "First we will bake," said the old woman. "I have already heated the oven and kneaded the dough." She pushed poor Gretel out to the oven, from which fiery flames were leaping. "I have already heated the oven and kneaded the dough." She pushed poor Gretel out to the oven, from which fiery flames were leaping. But Gretel saw what the witch had in mind and said, "I do not know how to do it. How do I get in?" "Stupid goose," said the old woman. "The opening is big enough. See, I could even get in myself." She hobbled up and stuck her head into the oven. Then Gretel gave her a push that sent her tumbling in. Gretel closed the iron door and fastened the bolt. The old woman began to howl frightfully. Gretel ran straight to Hansel, opened the stable door, and cried, "Hansel, we are saved. The old witch is dead." Then Hansel sprang out like a bird from its cage when someone opens its door. How happy they were! They threw their arms around each other's necks, jumped with joy, and kissed each other, because they no longer had anything to fear. They went into the witch's house. In every corner stood chests filled with pearls and precious stones. "These are even better than pebbles," said Hansel, filling his pockets. Gretel said, "I will take some home too," and filled her apron. After they had walked for a few hours, they came to a large body of water. "We cannot get across," said Hansel. "I see no bridge." "There is no boat either," answered Gretel. "But there is a white duck swimming." Little duck, here stand Gretel and Hansel. No bridge or path can we see. Please take us across on your white back." The little duck came to them, and Hansel climbed onto it, telling his sister to sit down beside him. "No," answered Gretel, "that will be too heavy for the little duck. It should take us across one at a time." The good little bird did this, and when they had gotten safely across and had walked on for a while, the forest became more and more familiar to them. Finally, They saw their father's house in the distance. The man had not had even one happy hour since he had left the children in the forest. However, his wife had died. Gretel shook out her apron, scattering pearls and precious stones around the room, and Hansel added to them by throwing one handful after the other from his pockets. The cottage was quiet for a long moment after Hilda finished. The fire crackled softly, and outside the wind had picked up again, whistling around the corners. The witch was evil, Klaus said finally, but Gretel was clever. She tricked the witch. She did indeed, Hilda said. When Hansel was locked up and could not help himself, Gretel found the courage and the cleverness to save them both. And their stepmother died, Greta said. Was that part of the magic too? Perhaps, Hilda said. Or perhaps it was simply that evil often brings its own end. The story does not say how she died, only that she did. Some say the witch and the stepmother were one and the same, that the witch was punished for her cruelty. But that is only speculation. I'm glad they found treasure, Hans said. Now they won't be poor any more. Yes, that is a comfort, Hilda agreed. They suffered greatly, but in the end they were rewarded for their courage and cleverness. That is often the way in the old tales. The journey is hard, but those who persevere and keep their wits about them find their way to happiness. She stood and moved to the window, looking out at the snow-covered wood. The day was passing, the light fading. Winter days were short. We should have some dinner, she said. She had vegetables from the cellar and dried beans and smoked pork. She could make a good stew. The children helped. Klaus fetched vegetables. Greta helped peel them. Hans watched the pot. As they worked, they talked about the stories. The stew bubbled and filled the cottage with its savory smell. When ready, she ladled it into wooden bowls. "This is good, grandmother," Klaus said. After dinner, they cleaned up and settled by the fire once more. The afternoon sun slanted through the windows. Outside, icicles dripped, creating a gentle rhythm. Hilda took up her knitting and began. The wife of a rich man fell ill. When she felt her end approaching, she called her only daughter to her bedside and said, "Dear child, remain pious and good. Then God will always be with you, and I will look down from heaven and watch over you." Then she closed her eyes and died. Every day the girl went to her mother's grave and wept. She remained pious and good. When winter came, the snow spread a white cloth over the grave. When spring's sun removed it, the man took another wife. One day, the woman was standing at the window, looking down into the garden when she noticed a bed planted with the most beautiful Rapunzel. It looked so fresh and green that she began to crave it. Her longing grew day by day, and because she knew she could not have any of it, she began to waste away. Her husband became alarmed and asked, "What is wrong, dear wife?" "Ah," she replied, "if I cannot get some of that Rapunzel from the garden behind our house to eat, I shall die." The man, who loved her dearly, thought to himself, "Before you let your wife die, you must get her some of that Rapunzel, no matter what the cost." So at twilight he climbed over the wall into the sorceress's garden, hastily grabbed a handful of Rapunzel, and brought it to his wife. She immediately made herself a salad and ate it with great relish. It tasted so good to her that the next day her craving was 3 times as great. It tasted so good to her that the next day her craving was 3 times as great. So at twilight he went again. But when he climbed down from the wall, he was terrified, for standing before him was the sorceress. "How dare you," she said, her eyes blazing with anger, "climb into my garden and steal my Rapunzel like a thief? You will pay for this." "Oh," he answered, "please temper justice with mercy. I only did this out of necessity. The sorceress's anger abated somewhat, and she said, 'If things are as you say, I will allow you to take as much Rapunzel as you want, but on one condition. You must give me the child that your wife will bring into the world. The child will fare well, and I will care for it like a mother.' In his fear, the man agreed to everything. When his wife gave birth, the sorceress appeared at once. Rapunzel grew to be the most beautiful child under the sun. When she was 12 years old, the sorceress locked her in a tower that stood in a forest. The tower had neither stairs nor a door, only a small window at the very top. When the sorceress wanted to enter, she stood below and called out, 'Rapunzel, Rapunzel, let down your hair.' Rapunzel had magnificent long hair, as fine as spun gold. When she heard the sorceress's voice, she would undo her braids, wind them around a window hook, and let her hair fall 20 yards to the ground below. The sorceress would then climb up. After a few years, it happened that a prince was riding through the forest and passed by the tower. He heard singing so lovely that he stopped to listen. It was Rapunzel, who in her solitude passed the time by letting her sweet voice resound. The prince wanted to climb up to her and looked for a door in the tower, but there was none to be found. Once when he was standing behind a tree, he saw the sorceress approach and heard her call out, 'Rapunzel, Rapunzel, let down your hair.' Then Rapunzel let down her braids, and the sorceress climbed up to her. 'If that is the ladder one must use to climb up, I will try my luck too,' thought the prince. The next day, when it began to grow dark, he went to the tower and called out, 'Rapunzel, Rapunzel, let down your hair.' The hair fell down at once, and the prince climbed up. At first Rapunzel was terribly frightened when a man came in, for she had never seen one before. But the prince began to talk to her in a friendly way, telling her that his heart had been so touched by her singing that he had no peace and had to see her. But the prince began to talk to her in a friendly way, telling her that his heart had been so touched by her singing that he had no peace and had to see her. She said, 'I would gladly go with you, but I do not know how to get down. Every time you come, bring a skein of silk with you.' The sorceress knew nothing of this until one day Rapunzel said to her without thinking, 'Tell me, Mother Gothel, why are you so much heavier to pull up than the young prince? He is with me in a moment.' 'You wicked child!' cried the sorceress. 'What am I hearing? I thought I had separated you from all the world, and yet you have deceived me.' In her rage, she grabbed Rapunzel's beautiful hair, wrapped it several times around her left hand, seized a pair of scissors with her right hand, and snip, snap, she cut off the beautiful braids, which fell to the ground. And she was so merciless that she took poor Rapunzel into a wilderness, where she had to live in great misery and want. On the evening of the same day that she had banished Rapunzel, The sorceress fastened the severed braids to the window hook. When the prince came and called out, "Rapunzel, Rapunzel, let down your hair," she let the hair down. The prince climbed up, but instead of finding his dearest Rapunzel at the top, he found the sorceress, who glared at him with wicked, venomous looks. "Ah!" she cried mockingly. "You have come to fetch your darling, but the beautiful bird is no longer sitting in her nest singing. The cat has got her and will scratch out your eyes as well. Rapunzel is lost to you." The prince was beside himself with grief, and in his despair he jumped from the tower. He escaped with his life, but the thorns into which he fell pierced his eyes. He wandered blind through the forest, eating nothing but roots and berries and doing nothing but lamenting and weeping over the loss of his dearest wife. He wandered in misery for several years, and finally came to the wilderness where Rapunzel lived with the twins, a boy and a girl, to whom she had given birth. He heard a voice that seemed so familiar to him, and he walked toward it. When he approached, Rapunzel recognized him. She fell on his neck and wept. 2 of her tears moistened his eyes, and they became clear again. He could see as well as before. He led her to his kingdom, where he was received with joy. They lived happily and contentedly for a long time. The cottage was quiet when Hilda finished. The fire had burned low, and the candle guttered. "She cried and healed him," Greta said softly. "Her tears had magic." "Not magic," Hilda said. "Love. Rapunzel's love for the prince was so strong that it healed him. That is the power love holds. The sorceress was cruel," Klaus said. "She was," Hilda agreed. "And in the end, what did it gain her? Rapunzel found love and freedom anyway. We cannot keep people locked away forever." Hans yawned widely. "Time for bed now," Hilda said firmly. The children didn't argue. They were tired from the morning's chores and the afternoon's storytelling. Hilda helped them settle onto their pallet once more, tucking the blankets around them. "Grandmother," Hans said sleepily, "will the stories always end happily?" Hilda considered this. "Not always, little one. Some of the old tales have sad endings, but even in those there are lessons to be learned. The stories teach us how to live, how to be brave, how to be kind. They teach us that actions have consequences, that evil often brings its own punishment, and that goodness, even when it suffers, is still worth choosing." "I like the happy endings better," Hans mumbled, already half asleep. "Most people do," Hilda said gently, smoothing his hair. "Sleep now, all of you." She returned to her chair and took up her knitting once more. The fire cast its gentle glow, and the children's breathing soon fell into the rhythm of deep sleep. Outside, the wind had died down, and fresh snow was falling softly, adding to the layers already on the ground. Hilda worked her needles, her hands moving in the practiced motions. She thought about the stories she'd told, the old tales that had been passed down through so many generations. Each one had survived because it carried something true, something worth preserving. The Golden Goose taught kindness and generosity. The Bremen town musicians taught the value of friendship and cooperation. The elves and the shoemaker taught gratitude and the principle of giving back. Hansel and Gretel taught courage and cleverness in the face of danger. Rapunzel taught the power of love and the importance of freedom. These were lessons that every generation needed to learn anew. The world changed, but human nature remained much the same. Children still needed to learn to be kind, to be brave, to be clever, to love truly. And stories were how those lessons were taught, wrapped up in magic and wonder so they would be remembered. Hilda glanced at the sleeping children and felt a wave of love for them. Klaus, trying so hard to be grown and responsible. Greta, curious and thoughtful. Little Hans, still young enough to believe in magic without question. They were good children, and they would grow into good adults, helped along by stories like these. The night deepened. The snow continued to fall, and in the cottage at the forest's edge, an old woman kept watch over her sleeping grandchildren, the keeper of stories, the link between past and future, ensuring that the old wisdom would not be forgotten. Tomorrow, she thought, if they asked, she would tell them more. There were so many stories still to tell. Rumpelstiltskin, with his impossible tasks and his terrible prize. Snow White, with her jealous stepmother and her poisoned apple. Cinderella, with her glass slippers and her fairy godmother. The stories went on, an endless treasure of wisdom and wonder. But for tonight, this was enough. The fire burned low, the children slept peacefully, and Grandmother Hilda worked her needles, content in her purpose, grateful for this time with her grandchildren, this chance to pass along the stories that mattered. Outside, the black forest stood silent under its blanket of snow. The trees were ancient and full of secrets. The paths wound deep into darkness. But here, in this small cottage, there was light and warmth and safety. Here the old magic of storytelling continued, as it had for thousands of years, as it would for thousands more. And that, perhaps, was the greatest magic of all. Not the magic in the stories, but the magic of the stories themselves. The magic that allowed wisdom to pass from one generation to the next. The magic that made the old tales new again with each telling. The magic that kept the past alive while teaching lessons for the future. Hilda smiled to herself and continued knitting. The scarf for Greta was nearly finished. Tomorrow she would start one for Klaus, and perhaps a small blanket for Hans and his wooden horse. Small acts of love, woven stitch by stitch, just as the old tales were woven word by word. The night passed slowly, peacefully, and in the morning when the children woke, there would be hot porridge again, and chores to do, and maybe, if they were good, more stories to hear. Stories of wishes and consequences, of kindness and cruelty, of magic both light and dark. Stories from the brothers Grimm, collected long ago but never growing old. Stories that would live on as long as there were grandmothers to tell them and children to listen. And so the tales would continue generation after generation, teaching and delighting, warning and inspiring, because that was what stories did. That was what they were for. The morning of the second day dawned bright. The storm had passed, and sunlight sparkled on fresh snow like scattered diamonds. Hilda woke early, moved to prepare the day. She built the fire, set water for washing, and made fried bread with honey and butter for breakfast. Klaus woke first, drawn by the smell. "Good morning, Grandmother. Something smells wonderful." "Good morning. Wake your brother and sister. Breakfast will be ready soon." The children gathered around the table. The fried bread was golden and crispy, drizzled with honey. They ate with obvious pleasure. "Grandmother," Greta said between bites, "will you tell us more stories today?" "We have another day before your parents can come," Hilda said. "I suppose we have time for a few more tales." "Can we hear about Snow White?" Greta asked eagerly. "Ah, Snow White," Hilda said, "a tale with much darkness in it. Are you certain you want to hear it?" All three children nodded vigorously. "Very well. But first, morning chores. Work first, then stories. That is the proper order." The children helped without complaint. Klaus brought firewood. Greta helped tidy the cottage. Hans kept the fire going and helped wash dishes. By mid-morning chores were done, and they settled by the fire. Through the windows they could see birds hopping in the snow. "Now then," Hilda said, taking up her knitting, "the tale of Snow White. Listen carefully, for this story teaches us about the dangers of vanity and jealousy, but also about the strength of kindness and the power of true love." She settled back in her chair, and her voice took on that storytelling quality that made the children lean forward in anticipation. Once upon a time, in the middle of winter, when the snowflakes were falling like feathers from the sky, a queen sat sewing at a window that had a frame of black ebony wood. As she sewed, she looked out at the snow. She pricked her finger with the needle, and 3 drops of blood fell onto the snow. She pricked her finger with the needle, and 3 drops of blood fell onto the snow. Soon afterward, she had a little daughter who was as white as snow, as red as blood, and as black as ebony wood. She was therefore called Snow White, but when the child was born, the queen died. After a year had passed, the king took another wife. She was a beautiful woman, but she was proud and arrogant, and she could not stand it if anyone might surpass her in beauty. She owned a magic mirror. "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who is the fairest of them all?" The mirror would answer, "You, O queen, are the fairest of all." Then she was satisfied, for she knew that the mirror spoke the truth. Snow White grew up and became more and more beautiful. When she was 7 years old, she was as beautiful as the bright day and more beautiful than the queen herself. "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who is the fairest of them all?" The mirror answered, "You, O queen, are fair, it's true, but Snow White is fairer than you." The queen was horrified. From that moment on, whenever she looked at Snow White, her heart turned cold. Envy and pride grew like weeds in her heart, taller and taller, until she had no peace day or night. Finally she called a huntsman and said, "Take the child out into the forest. I never want to see her again." Greta gasped. She wanted to kill her own stepdaughter? "She did," Hilda said gravely. "Jealousy had poisoned her heart completely. But listen and see what happened." The huntsman obeyed and took Snow White into the forest. When he drew his knife and was about to pierce Snow White's innocent heart, she began to cry and said, "Oh, dear huntsman, let me live." Because she was so beautiful, the huntsman took pity on her and said, "Run away, you poor child." He thought to himself, "The wild animals will soon devour her anyway." But it felt as though a stone had been lifted from his heart, because he did not have to kill her. A young boar came running by at that moment, and he killed it cut out its lungs and liver and brought them to the queen as proof. The cook had to cook them in salt, and the wicked woman ate them, believing she had eaten Snow White's lungs and liver. The cook had to cook them in salt, and the wicked woman ate them, believing she had eaten Snow White's lungs and liver. Now, the poor child was all alone in the great forest, and she was so frightened that she looked at every leaf on every tree and did not know what to do. She began to run over sharp stones and through thorns. Wild animals jumped near her, but they did her no harm. Everything in the house was small, but neater and cleaner than words can say. There was a little table set with a white cloth, and on it were 7 little plates, each with its own spoon, and 7 little knives and forks, and 7 little cups. Snow White was so hungry and thirsty that she ate a few vegetables and a little bread from each little plate, and drank a drop of wine from each little cup, for she did not want to take everything from one place. Then, because she was so tired, she lay down on one of the little beds. But none of them suited her. One was too long, another too short. When it had become quite dark, the owners of the house came home. They were 7 dwarfs who mined for ore in the mountains. They lit their 7 little candles, and as soon as it became light in their house, they saw that someone had been there, for not everything was in the same order as they had left it. The first one said, "Who has been sitting in my chair?" The second, "Who has been eating from my plate?" The third, "Who has been eating my bread?" The fourth, "Who has been eating my vegetables?" The fifth, "Who has been using my fork?" The sixth, "Who has been cutting with my knife?" The seventh, "Who has been drinking from my cup?" Then the first one looked around and saw that there was a little hollow in his bed, and he said, "Who has been lying in my bed?" The others came running, and each one cried, "Someone has been lying in my bed too." But the 7th, when he looked at his bed, saw Snow White lying there asleep. He called the others, who came running and shouted with amazement. Oh my goodness, oh my goodness," they cried. "How beautiful this child is." They were so happy that they did not wake her up, but let her continue sleeping in the little bed. The 7th dwarf slept with his companions, 1 hour with each, and thus the night passed. When it was morning, Snow White woke up, and when she saw the 7 dwarves, she was frightened, but they were friendly and asked, "What is your name?" "My name is Snow White," she answered. "How did you come to our house?" the dwarfs asked. "How did you come to our house?" the dwarfs asked. The dwarfs said, "If you will keep house for us, cook, make beds, wash, sew, and knit, and if you will keep everything neat and clean, you can stay with us, and you shall want for nothing." "Yes," said Snow White, "with all my heart," and she stayed with them. She kept their house in order. In the mornings they went to the mountains looking for ore and gold. In the mornings they went to the mountains looking for ore and gold. During the day the girl was alone. The good dwarfs warned her, saying, "Oh, be careful of your stepmother. She will soon know that you are here. Do not let anyone in." Now the queen, believing that she had eaten Snow White's lungs and liver, could only think that she was again the first and the most beautiful woman of all. "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who is the fairest of them all?" The mirror answered Ra, "You, O Queen, are fair, it's true, but Snow White beyond the mountains blue, with the 7 dwarfs she now does dwell, is 1,000 times more fair than you." The Queen was shocked, for she knew that the mirror never lied. She realized that the huntsman had deceived her, and that Snow White was still alive. Finally, she thought of something. She painted her face and dressed herself like an old peddler woman so that no one could recognize her. In this disguise, she went to the house of the 7 dwarfs. She knocked on the door and called out, "Beautiful wares for sale." Snow White looked out the window and called, "Good day, dear woman. What do you have to sell?" "Good wares, beautiful wares," she answered. "Bodice laces in all colors." And she pulled out one that was braided from colorful silk. "Child," said the old woman, "how you look! Come, I will lace you up properly." Snow White suspected nothing. She stood before her and let herself be laced up with the new lace. But the old woman laced so quickly and so tightly that Snow White lost her breath and fell down as if dead. Not long afterward, in the evening, the 7 dwarfs came home. How terrified they were when they saw their dear Snow White lying on the ground, not moving at all, as if she were dead. They lifted her up, and when they saw that she was laced too tightly, they cut the lace in two. Then she began to breathe a little, and slowly came back to life. When the dwarfs heard what had happened, they said, "The old peddler woman was no one else but the godless queen." When the dwarfs heard what had happened, they said, "The old peddler woman was no one else but the godless queen." When the wicked woman returned home, she stepped before her mirror and asked, "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who is the fairest of them all?" The mirror answered as before, "You, O Queen, are fair, it's true, but Snow White beyond the mountains blue, with the 7 dwarfs she now does dwell, is 1,000 times more fair than you." When she heard this, all her blood ran to her heart because she was so terrified, for she saw clearly that Snow White had come back to life. "This time," she said, "I will think of something that will destroy you." Using witch's art that she understood, she made a poisoned comb. Then she disguised herself, taking the form of a different old woman. Snow White looked out and said, "Go away. I am not allowed to let anyone in." "But surely you are allowed to look," said the old woman, and she pulled out the poisoned comb and held it up. The child liked it so much that she let herself be fooled, and she opened the door. After they had agreed on a price, the old woman said, "Now I will comb your hair properly." Poor Snow White suspected nothing, and let the old woman do as she pleased. But she had scarcely stuck the comb into her hair than the poison took effect, and the girl fell down unconscious. But she had scarcely stuck the comb into her hair than the poison took effect, and the girl fell down unconscious. Fortunately, it was almost evening, and the 7 dwarfs came home. When they saw Snow White lying on the ground as if dead, they immediately suspected the stepmother. They examined her and found the poisoned comb. They had scarcely pulled it out when Snow White came to herself again and told them what had happened. Once again, they warned her to be on guard and not to open the door for anyone. At home, the queen stepped before her mirror and said, Mirror, mirror on the wall, who is the fairest of them all? The mirror answered as before, You, O Queen, are fair, it's true, but Snow White beyond the mountains blue, with the 7 dwarfs she now does dwell, is 1,000 times more fair than you. When she heard the mirror say this, she trembled and shook with anger. Snow White shall die, she cried out, even if it costs me my own life. Then she went into a very secret, lonely room where no one ever went, and there she made a poisonous apple. On the outside it was beautiful, white with red cheeks, so that anyone who saw it would want it, but anyone who ate even the smallest piece of it would die. When the apple was finished, she painted her face and disguised herself as a peasant woman, and thus she went to the house of the 7 dwarfs. She knocked. Snow White stuck her head out the window and said, I am not allowed to let anyone in. The 7 dwarfs have forbidden me to do so. That is all right with me, answered the peasant woman. I'll easily get rid of my apples. Here, I will give you one as a gift. No, said Snow White, I am not allowed to accept anything. Are you afraid of poison? Said the old woman. Look, I'll cut the apple in 2. Look, I'll cut the apple in 2. Now, the apple had been so artfully made that only the red half was poisoned. Snow White longed for the beautiful apple, and when she saw that the peasant woman was eating part of it, she could no longer resist. She stuck her hand out and took the poisoned half. The queen looked at her with a gruesome stare, laughed loudly, and said, White as snow, red as blood, black as ebony wood, this time the dwarfs cannot awaken you. At home she asked her mirror, Mirror, mirror on the wall, who is the fairest of them all? Finally it answered, You, O Queen, are the fairest of all. Then her envious heart was at rest, as well as an envious heart can be at rest. When the dwarfs came home that evening, they found Snow White lying on the ground. No breath came from her mouth, and she was dead. They lifted her up and looked for something poisonous. They unlaced her, combed her hair, washed her with water and wine, but nothing helped. The dear child was dead, and remained dead. They laid her on a bier, and all 7 sat next to her and mourned her and cried for 3 days. They said, We cannot bury her in the black earth, and they had a transparent glass coffin made so she could be seen from all sides. They laid her inside and wrote her name on it in golden letters, indicating that she was a princess. Then they set the coffin outside on a mountain, and one of them always stayed by it and watched over it. Then they set the coffin outside on a mountain, and one of them always stayed by it and watched over it. Snow White lay in the coffin for a long, long time, and she did not decay. She looked as though she were asleep, for she was still as white as snow, as red as blood, and as black-haired as ebony wood. Now it happened that a prince came into the woods and went to the dwarf's house to spend the night. He saw the coffin on the mountain, with beautiful Snow White inside, and he read what was written on it in golden letters. Then he said to the dwarfs, Let me have the coffin. I will give you whatever you want for it. But the dwarfs answered, We will not sell it for all the gold in the world. Then he said, Then give it to me as a gift, for I cannot live without seeing Snow White. The prince had his servants carry it away on their shoulders. Now it happened that they stumbled over a bush, and from the jolt the piece of poisoned apple that Snow White had bitten off came out of her throat. Not long afterward she opened her eyes, lifted the lid from her coffin, sat up, and was alive again. "Good heavens, where am I?" she cried out. The prince said joyfully, "You are with me." And he told her what had happened, saying, "I love you more than anything else in the world. Come with me to my father's castle and become my wife." Snow White loved him, and she went with him. Snow White's godless stepmother was also invited to the feast. After putting on her beautiful clothes, she stepped before her mirror and said, "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who is the fairest of them all?" The mirror answered, "You, O queen, are fair, it's true, but the young queen is 1,000 times more fair than you." The wicked woman uttered a curse, and she became so frightened that she did not know what to do. At first she did not want to go to the wedding, but she found no peace. She had to go and see the young queen. When she arrived and recognized Snow White, she stood still with fear and terror. But iron slippers had already been heated over a fire, and they were brought in with tongs and set before her. But iron slippers had already been heated over a fire, and they were brought in with tongs and set before her. The cottage was very quiet when Hilda finished. Even the fire seemed to burn more softly, as if awed by the darkness in the tale. "Ah, that's terrible," Greta whispered. "The queen had to dance until she died." "Justice in the old tales is often harsh," Hilda said. "The queen tried 3 times to murder an innocent girl out of nothing but jealousy. She poisoned Snow White with vanity and envy. In the end, she received the fate she had planned for others. But Snow White was saved," Hans said, "because the prince loved her." "Indeed," Hilda agreed. "And notice she was saved not because she was beautiful, but because she was kind. The huntsmen spared her because of her innocence. The dwarfs took her in because she was willing to work and care for them. The prince loved her truly. Beauty fades, children, but kindness, that lasts forever." Klaus nodded thoughtfully. "And the queen's beauty didn't make her happy. It made her miserable because she was always afraid someone would be more beautiful." "A wise observation," Hilda said. "Vanity is a trap. The more we care about such shallow things, the more we suffer. True beauty comes from within, from how we treat others, from the goodness of our hearts." She glanced out the window. The afternoon was growing late, and tomorrow the children would return home. This would be their last evening of stories together, at least for this visit. "One more tale," she said, "and then we must prepare for your journey home tomorrow. This last story is perhaps the most famous of all." The children settled in for the final tale, savoring these last moments by the fire. There was once a rich man whose wife lay sick, and when she felt her end drawing near, she called her only daughter to her bedside and said, "Dear child, be good and pious, and God will always take care of you, and I will look down on you from heaven and will be with you." Then she closed her eyes and died. The girl went every day to her mother's grave and wept, and she remained good and pious. The new wife brought 2 daughters into the house with her. They were beautiful and fair in appearance, but ugly and black in their hearts. A difficult time began for the poor stepchild. "Is this stupid goose to sit in the parlor with us?" they said. "Whoever wants to eat bread must earn it. Out with the kitchen maid." They took away her beautiful clothes and gave her an old gray smock to wear and wooden shoes. There she had to do hard work from morning until evening. She had to get up before daybreak, carry water, make the fire, cook and wash. Besides that, the sisters did everything they could to cause her grief. They ridiculed her and scattered peas and lentils into the ashes, so she had to sit and pick them out again. In the evening, when she was exhausted from work, there was no bed for her. Instead, she had to lie in the ashes by the hearth. It happened that the father wanted to go to the fair. He asked his 2 stepdaughters what he should bring back for them. "Beautiful dresses," said one. "Pearls and jewels," said the other. "And you, Cinderella," he said, "what do you want?" "Father, break off the first twig that brushes against your hat on your way home and bring it to me." So he bought beautiful dresses, pearls, and jewels for the 2 stepsisters. On his way home, as he was riding through a green thicket, a hazel twig brushed against him and knocked off his hat. When he arrived home, he gave his stepdaughters what they had asked for, and he gave Cinderella the twig from the hazel bush. Cinderella thanked him, went to her mother's grave and planted the twig on it. She cried so much that her tears fell, and watered it. It grew and became a beautiful tree. Cinderella went to the tree 3 times every day, cried and prayed, and a little white bird always came to the tree. Cinderella went to the tree 3 times every day, cried and prayed, and a little white bird always came to the tree. Now it happened that the king announced a festival that was to last 3 days. All the beautiful young girls in the land were invited, so that his son could select a bride. When the 2 stepsisters heard that they too had been invited, they were in high spirits. They called Cinderella and said, "Comb our hair, brush our shoes, and fasten our buckles. We are going to the festival at the king's castle." Cinderella obeyed, but she cried, because she too would have liked to go to the dance, and she begged her stepmother to allow her to go. "You, Cinderella," she said, "you are covered with dust and dirt, and you want to go to the festival. You are covered with dust and dirt, and you want to go to the festival." However, because Cinderella kept asking, the stepmother finally said, "I have scattered a bowl of lentils into the ashes. If you can pick them out in 2 hours, then you may go." The girl went through the back door into the garden and called out, "You tame pigeons, you turtle doves, and all you birds beneath the sky, come and help me pick the good ones into the pot, the bad ones into your crop." Then 2 white pigeons came in through the kitchen window, and then the turtle doves, and finally all the birds beneath the sky came flocking and settled down by the ashes. The pigeons nodded their heads and began to pick, peck, pick, peck, and then all the others began to pick, peck, pick, peck, and they put all the good lentils into the bowl. The girl took the bowl to her stepmother, and she was happy, thinking that now she would be allowed to go to the festival. But the stepmother said, "No, Cinderella, you have no clothes, and you don't know how to dance. As soon as the stepmother had scattered the 2 bowls of lentils into the ashes, the girl went through the back door into the garden and called out, "You tame pigeons, you turtle doves, and all you birds beneath the sky, come and help me pick the good ones into the pot, the bad ones into your crop." Then 2 white pigeons came in through the kitchen window, and then the turtle doves, and finally all the birds beneath the sky came flocking and settled down by the ashes. The pigeons nodded their heads and began to pick, peck, pick, peck, and then all the others began to pick, peck, and they put all the good lentils into the bowls. The girl took the bowls to her stepmother, and she was happy, thinking that now she would be allowed to go to the festival. But the stepmother said, "It's no use. You are not coming with us because you have no clothes and you don't know how to dance." When everyone had left, Cinderella went to her mother's grave beneath the hazel tree and cried out, "Shake and quiver, little tree, throw gold and silver down on me." Then the bird threw down a dress of gold and silver, and slippers embroidered with silk and silver. She quickly put on the dress and went to the festival. Her stepsisters and her stepmother did not recognize her, and thought she must be a foreign princess, for she looked so beautiful in the golden dress. Her stepsisters and her stepmother did not recognize her, and thought she must be a foreign princess, for she looked so beautiful in the golden dress. The prince approached her, took her by the hand, and danced with her. Furthermore, he would not dance with anyone else, and he never let go of her hand. When someone else came and asked her to dance, he said, "She is my dance partner." She danced until evening, and then she wanted to go home. The prince said, "I will go along and escort you," for he wanted to see to whom the beautiful girl belonged. However, she eluded him and jumped into the pigeon house. The old man thought, could it be Cinderella? And he had them bring him an axe and a pick so he could break the pigeon house apart. But no one was inside. When they got home, Cinderella was lying in the ashes in her dirty clothes, and a dim oil lamp was burning in the fireplace. Cinderella had quickly jumped down from the back of the pigeon house and had run to the hazel tree. There she had taken off her beautiful clothes and laid them on the grave, and the bird had taken them away again. There she had taken off her beautiful clothes and laid them on the grave, and the bird had taken them away again. The next day, when the festival began again, and her parents and stepsisters had gone, Cinderella went to the hazel tree and said, "Shake and quiver, little tree, throw gold and silver down on me." Then the bird threw down an even more magnificent dress than the one before. When Cinderella appeared at the festival in this dress, everyone was astonished at her beauty. The prince had waited until she came, then immediately took her by the hand and danced only with her. When evening came, she said she wanted to go home. The prince followed her, wanting to see into which house she went. But she ran away from him and into the garden behind the house. A beautiful tall tree stood there, on which the most magnificent pears hung. She climbed up into its branches as nimbly as a squirrel, and the prince did not know where she had gone. She climbed up into its branches as nimbly as a squirrel, and the prince did not know where she had gone. The father thought, could it be Cinderella? And he had an axe brought to him and cut down the tree, but no one was in it. On the third day, when her parents and sisters had gone away, Cinderella went again to her mother's grave and said to the tree, "Shake and quiver, little tree, throw gold and silver down on me." This time the bird threw down a dress that was more splendid and magnificent than any she had yet had, and the slippers were of pure gold. When she arrived at the festival in this dress, everyone was so astonished that they did not know what to say. When evening came, Cinderella wanted to leave, and the prince tried to escort her, but she ran away from him so quickly that he could not follow. However, the prince had set a trap. He had ordered the entire stairway to be coated with pitch. When the girl ran down the stairs, her left slipper stuck in the pitch. The prince picked it up. It was small and dainty and of pure gold. The next morning he went with it to the man and said to him, "No one shall be my wife except for the one whose foot fits this golden shoe." The two sisters were happy to hear this, for they had pretty feet. The oldest took the shoe into her room to try it on, and her mother stood by. However, she could not get her big toe into it, for the shoe was too small. Then her mother gave her a knife and said, "Cut off your toe." The girl cut off her toe, forced her foot into the shoe, swallowed the pain, and went out to the prince. He took her on his horse as his bride and rode away with her. However, they had to ride past the grave, and two pigeons were sitting in the hazel tree. They cried out, "Rook-de-goo, rook-de-goo, there's blood in the shoe is too tight, this bride is not right." Then he looked at her foot and saw how the blood was running from it. He turned his horse around and took the false bride home again, saying that she was not the right one, and that the other sister should try on the shoe. Then her mother gave her a knife and said, "Cut a piece off your heel. When you are queen, you will no longer have to go on foot." The girl cut a piece off her heel, forced her foot into the shoe, swallowed the pain, and went out to the prince. He took her on his horse as his bride and rode away with her. When they passed the hazel tree, the two pigeons were sitting in it, and they cried out, "Oh, rook-de-goo, rook-de-goo, there's blood in the shoe is too tight, this bride is not right." He looked down at her foot and saw how the blood was running out of her shoe, and how it had stained her white stocking all red. Then he turned his horse around and took the false bride home again. "This is not the right one either," he said. "Don't you have another daughter?" "No," said the man. The prince told him to send her to him, but the mother answered, "Oh no, she is much too dirty, she cannot be seen." But the prince insisted, and they had to call Cinderella. She first washed her hands and face clean, and then went and bowed down before the prince, who gave her the golden shoe. She sat down on a stool, pulled her foot out of the heavy wooden shoe, and put it into the slipper. She sat down on a stool, pulled her foot out of the heavy wooden shoe, and put it into the slipper. When she stood up and the prince looked her in the face, he recognized the beautiful girl who had danced with him. He cried out, "She is my true bride." The stepmother and the two sisters were horrified and turned pale with anger. The prince, however, took Cinderella on his horse and rode away with her. Rook-de-goo, rook-de-goo, no blood's in the shoe. The shoe's not too tight, this bride is right. After they had cried this out, they both flew down and landed on Cinderella's shoulders, one on the right, one on the left, and remained sitting there. When Cinderella's wedding to the prince was to be celebrated, the two false sisters came, wanting to gain favor with Cinderella and to share her good fortune. When the bridal couple walked into the church, the older sister walked on their right side, and the younger on their left side. Then the pigeons pecked out one eye from each of them. Afterward, as they came out of the church, the older one was on the left side, and the younger one on the right side, and then the pigeons pecked out the other eye from each of them. The cottage was silent for a long moment. The fire had burned down to embers, casting a soft, warm glow. Outside, the stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky. The sisters were punished too, Klaus said quietly, just like the queen in Snow White. They were, Hilda agreed. They had treated Cinderella cruelly for years, mocking her, making her do all the work, denying her even the smallest kindness. And when they tried to deceive the prince, cutting their own feet to fit the shoe, they showed how far their wickedness would go. The punishment fit the crime. But Cinderella was kind, even when they were mean to her, Greta said. She didn't try to get revenge. Exactly, Hilda said, her eyes warm. That is the lesson, dear one. Cinderella remained good and patient, even when life was hard and people were cruel. She honored her mother's memory by staying true to her gentle nature, and in the end, that goodness was rewarded, not because she was beautiful, though she was. The birds helped her, Hans observed, because she was kind to them. Yes, Hilda said, when we are kind to all creatures, great and small, that kindness comes back to us. The birds at her mother's grave helped her because she had earned their love through her gentleness. She looked at each of her grandchildren in turn. Klaus, who was learning to be strong and responsible. Greta, who was curious and thoughtful. Hans, who still saw magic in the world. She loved them each so dearly. Tomorrow you will go home, she said softly, and I will miss you terribly, but you will carry these stories with you. When life is hard, remember Cinderella's patience. When you are afraid, remember Hansel and Gretel's courage. When someone offers you more than you have, remember Dumpling's generosity. When you feel trapped, remember Rapunzel's hope. When you feel trapped, remember Rapunzel's hope. Will you tell us more stories next time we visit? Hans asked. As many as you wish, Hilda promised. There are so many tales still to tell. The Frog Prince, Little Red Riding Hood, Sleeping Beauty, the Wolf and the 7 Young Kids, and so many more. The brothers Grimm collected hundreds of stories, and I know them all. Good, Klaus said, trying to sound grown up, but unable to hide the eagerness in his voice. Because I want to hear them all. Hilda smiled. Then you shall. But for now, it is time for bed. Tomorrow will be a long day of travel, and you need your rest. She helped them prepare for sleep one last time, tucking them into their blankets by the fire. She kissed each forehead, whispered a blessing over each head. When they were settled, she returned to her chair and her knitting. But she did not work long. She was tired too, and her heart was full. full of love for these children, full of gratitude for this time together, full of hope for their futures. Outside, the night was clear and cold. The stars shone brilliantly in the winter sky. The snow lay peaceful and pure over the forest, and in the cottage 4 people slept safe and warm, surrounded by the magic of stories told and remembered. The old tales would live on, pass from grandmother to grandchildren, from one generation to the next, teaching their lessons of courage and kindness, warning of the dangers of greed and cruelty, showing that even in the darkest times, hope and goodness could prevail. And in the morning, when the children set off for home, they would carry those stories with them. They would tell them to their own children someday, and the magic would continue, unbroken, eternal, because that is what stories do. They connect us to the past and guide us toward the future. They teach us who we are and who we might become. They are the threads that weave together the generations, binding us all in a common humanity. And that, perhaps, is the greatest magic of all. And that, my dear friends, is where we'll end our time in the cottage at the forest's edge. I hope you enjoyed this cozy collection of Grimm tales, shared by firelight while the snow fell outside. May you always find warmth, safety, and stories in your life. These tales have survived for centuries because they speak to something true in the human heart. They teach us how to live, how to love, how to be brave, how to be kind. Pass them on. Tell them to your children and grandchildren. Keep the old magic alive. Until next time, stay safe and sweet dreams. E-days, he said. If by that time you can discover my name, you may keep your child. Through the whole night, the queen thought of all the names she had ever heard, and she sent a messenger throughout the country to inquire far and wide what other names there were. The next day, when the little man came, she began with Caspar, Melchior, and Balthazar, and she said all the names she knew, one after another. On the second day, she had inquiries made throughout the neighborhood for people's names, and she told the little man the most unusual and strange names. On the third day, the messenger came back and said, I have not been able to find any new names. But as I came around a high mountain near the edge of the forest, where the fox and the hare say good night to one another, I saw a little house. In front of the house a fire was burning, and around the fire a very ridiculous little man was jumping. He was hopping on one leg and crying out, Today I'll brew, tomorrow I'll bake, soon the child is mine to take. How glad I am that no one knows I'm called Rumpelstiltskin, as everyone knows. You can imagine how happy the queen was when she heard that name. Soon afterward, the little man walked in and asked, Now, your majesty, what is my name? At first she asked, Is your name Conrad? No. Is your name Harry? No. Perhaps your name is Rumpelstiltskin? The devil told you that! The devil told you that! Cried the little man. In his rage, he stomped his right foot so hard into the ground that he sank in up to his waist. The cottage was filled with the warm glow of firelight. Outside, night had fully fallen, and stars were beginning to appear in the clear sky. He tore himself in two, Hans asked, his eyes wide. Ah, that is what the story says, Hilda confirmed. His rage was so great that it destroyed him. That is another lesson about anger and pride. When we let these emotions control us, we can destroy ourselves. The queen got to keep her baby, Greta said with satisfaction, because she figured out his name. She did, Hilda agreed. And she was helped by the messenger who heard Rumpelstiltskin singing his own name. Sometimes help comes from unexpected places, but also the queen herself was clever. She started with the most common names first, buying herself time, then moved to unusual names, and finally revealed the true name only at the last moment. She used her wits. Klaus frowned thoughtfully. But she shouldn't have promised her baby in the first place. That was wrong. You are absolutely correct, Hilda said, nodding approvingly. The queen made a foolish promise when she was desperate. That is the central lesson of this tale. We must be careful about the promises we make, especially when we are in trouble. A promise is sacred. It should not be given lightly. She set down her knitting and stood. Now then, it is time for supper. I have just enough vegetables and broth for one more good meal, and then tomorrow your parents will come, and you will go home. The children helped prepare the evening meal. It was simple, just vegetable soup and the last of the bread, but it tasted wonderful after the long day of stories and chores. They ate by firelight, talking about the tales they'd heard, arguing about which was their favorite. Klaus liked the Bremen town musicians best, because it showed how the weak could overcome the strong by working together. Greta loved Cinderella, because kindness was rewarded in the end. Hans couldn't decide between the golden goose and the elves and the shoemaker, because both had happy endings and helpful magic. After supper, they cleaned up and prepared for bed. The children were tired but happy, their heads full of stories. As Hilda tucked them into their pallet, Greta asked, "Grandmother, are the stories true?" Hilda considered this carefully. The stories are true in the ways that matter most. They teach us how to live, how to treat one another, what to value. They show us that kindness is rewarded, that evil brings its own punishment, that love is powerful, that we must keep our promises. These truths are as real as the snow outside. But did a girl really spin straw into gold? Hans asked sleepily. Perhaps not literally, Hilda said. But people throughout history have turned simple things into valuable things through hard work. Isn't that a kind of magic? She kissed each forehead. Sleep now. Dream of golden geese and brave musicians, of true love and happy endings. The children's eyes closed, and soon their breathing deepened into sleep. Hilda returned to her chair and took up her knitting once more. The fire crackled softly, casting dancing shadows on the walls. She thought about the stories she'd told over these 2 days, each one a jewel polished by time, passed down through countless generations. Some of them were darker than others. Some had lessons that were harsh, but all of them were valuable. All of them had something to teach. The world the children would grow up in would be different from the world of the stories. There would be no witches in candy houses, no dwarfs in the mountains, no princes searching for brides with a golden slipper. But there would still be greed and kindness, cruelty and love, danger and safety. There would still be choices to make, promises to keep, challenges to overcome. And the stories would help them. The stories would give them frameworks for understanding the world. The stories would show them that they were not alone, that others had faced similar struggles, that goodness could triumph over evil, that love could heal, that cleverness and courage could save the day. Hilda smiled to herself as she worked her needles. This was her purpose, her gift to her grandchildren. The stories, the old wisdom passed down through ages, wrapped in magic and wonder. Outside, the black forest stood silent under its blanket of snow. The stars wheeled overhead. The world slept, peaceful and cold. But here, in this cottage, the stories lived. An old woman kept watch, the keeper of tales, ensuring the old magic would not die. Tomorrow the children would go home and take the stories with them. Someday they would tell these same tales to their own grandchildren. The stories would go on generation after generation, teaching and delighting, warning and inspiring. That was the greatest magic of all. The night deepened, the fire burned low, and Grandmother Hilda continued her knitting, content in the knowledge that she had done her part. She had passed the stories on. She had kept the old wisdom alive, and that was enough. The next morning arrived bright and clear. True to Hilda's prediction, the children's parents came shortly after breakfast, traveling through the snow on a sturdy wagon. There were tears and laughter, hugs and kisses. "Tell father what grandmother taught us," Greta said excitedly. "She told us stories," Klaus added, "the old stories from the brothers Grimm." As the family prepared to leave, each child hugged Hilda tightly. "Thank you, Grandmother," they said. "Thank you for the stories." "You are most welcome, my dears," Hilda said. "Remember what you learned. Be kind, be brave, be true, and always remember that you are loved." The wagon pulled away, the children waving until they disappeared around a bend. Hilda stood in her doorway, watching them go, then turned back to her cottage. There was work to be done, and life went on, as it always did. But she had the memories. She had passed something precious to the next generation. The stories would live. The wisdom would endure. She hummed as she worked. The same old tune her grandmother had taught her, the melody connecting her to all who had come before and all who would come after. And that, my dear friends, is where we'll end our time in the cottage at the forest's edge. I hope you enjoyed this cozy collection of grim tales, shared by firelight while the snow fell outside. May you always find warmth, safety, and stories in your life. These tales have survived for centuries because they speak to something true in the human heart. They teach us how to live, how to love, how to be brave, how to be kind. Pass them on. Tell them to your children and grandchildren. Keep the old magic alive. And that, my dear friends, is where we'll end our time in the cottage at the forest's edge. I hope you enjoyed this cozy collection of grim tales, shared by firelight while the snow fell outside. May you always find warmth, safety, and stories in your life. These tales have survived for centuries because they speak to something true in the human heart. They teach us how to live, how to love, how to be brave, how to be kind. Pass them on. Tell them to your children and grandchildren. Keep the old magic alive. And that, my dear friends, is where we'll end our time in the cottage at the forest's edge. I hope you enjoyed this cozy collection of grim tales shared by firelight while the snow fell outside. May you always find warmth, safety, and stories in your life. These tales have survived for centuries because they speak to something true in the human heart. They teach us how to live, how to love, how to be brave, how to be kind. Pass them on. Tell them to your children and grandchildren. Keep the old magic alive. Until next time, stay safe and sweet dreams.